Line for how you live today and in the future. We are in family furniture at floydhome.com. Just look.
Recording in progress. Recording in progress.
So Vivian and Molly. Vivian and Molly on either. And then the two, yeah, and then we have the moderator. I don't know, do they have their name tags?
I'm not sure.
These are the only ones that present that name.
I can ask.
Yeah, ask Michaela. So Vivian's on mine. Nikki, yeah, put, and then Caroline, the two moderators. Yeah. Okay. Moderator. So then let's place these two together. Yeah. We're like. Then sharing everything.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Okay. And do we want to have one?
Yeah, the moderator.
Is this one on?
Have to start with it. Huh?
Is this one being used?
Yeah, that one. Yeah, the more we have, the easier it is. But.
I see. Yeah. So it's wrong. Yeah. But it's good.
Can everyone on Zoom hear me when I talk into the mic here? Awesome.
Hi. I'm Carolina. Nice to meet you. I will give my careful, but yes, that's correct. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, good. I'm glad you think so. Adams.
Yes.
Marketplace.
Yes.
Yeah.
She's a funny one.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I
She
love
always-
Kimberly.
she always
She's the
talks to you
best.
guys.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I'm
Oh, great. Good, good. Yeah, she's awesome.
so we have. So we added some questions in.
No worries.
Mainly, I think, people are just to support journalism and succeed and
Oh, okay, that's easy.
like. Oh, and what does it take to bring about gender?
Okay.
Press Rita.
Great.
Yeah.
Voila.
Perfect. I'm glad to do this. I went to the Tufts and Fletcher, and I was part of institutional leadership of the big program. So this is like a special place for me. Good. Nice to meet Elisa. Have you guys met yet?
Hi.
So nice to meet you. I feel like we've been on many emails
Probably.
before together. It's really a pleasure to meet you. Thank you. Yeah. I'm looking forward to this. Yes, absolutely. I didn't know because I'm a huge support to the zone.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Such a big fan.
I'm so glad. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started now. My name is Carolina Hidalgo McCabe, and I am the co-president of the Middle East Research Group, an EPIC student this year, and a Tufts senior studying international relations and civic studies. I'm so excited to be moderating today with Samantha, a Tufts IGL alum, focusing on the role of women in journalism. In the United States, women make up 2/3 of journalism graduates, yet newsrooms remain male-dominated, which many argue carries over to the topics covered and the voices heard. Furthermore, women journalists generate only 36% of bylines, and women comprise just 15% of photojournalists. Female journalists like Evgenia Albatz, Martha Gellhorn, Nilüfer Hamedi, Hu Shuli, and Shireen Abu Akleh have dedicated their lives to report the truth and have risked or lost their lives as they faced off with systems of oppression, using their pens and voices as their only weapons. Today, we are joined by 4 brilliant women journalists who are changing the field with their courage, honesty, and storytelling skills. Each panelist will give a 5-minute opening remark after I introduce them, and we will follow this by a discussion moderated by myself and Samantha, and finally, we will enter an audience Q&A. First off, we have Molly Farrell. She is a photographer, filmmaker, and National Geographic explorer dedicated to documenting the changing relationships between people and nature. Molly has collaborated with forest rangers, conservation biologists, wildlife crime investigators, government officials, and local communities in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. She's a Tufts 2012 alumna and was part of the IGL through the Program for Narrative and Documentary Practice, PNDP, and BUILD. Molly, you may give your opening remarks.
Hi. Well, first I want to say thank you so much for having me here. And it's really special for me because the IGL was really formative in my own college experience. I felt like it was kind of part of what helped me choose this path, my mentors there and the classes that I took and the community that I had there and the conferences that I was able to attend. So thank you so much for having me here. It's wonderful to be able to kind of share in this space that was so important to me while I was there. And I think that this topic of women in journalism
Thank you so much, Molly. Next, we have Elisa Liz Munoz. Elisa Liz Munoz is the executive director of the International Women's Media Foundation. Elisa leads the organization to achieve its mission to support women journalists and develop their careers by providing training, tools, and assistance. Elisa's nearly 2 decades at the IWMF have made her a leading expert on the intersections between gender equity and press freedom. She is a relentless advocate for women journalists, striving to prioritize their voices in all press freedom conversations.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody, for being here. The IWMF has been around for 30 years. It was founded by a group of women journalists who really focused on career advancement, the glass ceiling that has yet to be shattered, unfortunately, all over the world, just at various degrees. I think it's been extremely well documented, the lack of representation in the news media of women. But the organization has really evolved, and we've come to the understanding and recognition, the vital recognition, that you can't just fight for one group's rights. You really have to be holistic in your approach. So really what we're focusing on is not just the right of women to be part of the news media, but diversity in the news media and the critical importance of representation of all communities in the news media. Our logo, our saying used to be, you can't have press freedom with the equal access of women in the news media. And you really need access of everybody. Reporters should be reporting on the communities that they come from, and everybody should have the opportunity to report on any issue. And that really came into play most recently in the US around the social justice movement, where some of you probably heard or were part of conversations of certain journalists being kept out of reporting of protests because their editors felt that they were too close to the story. That is absolutely unacceptable, and we reject that notion wholeheartedly. Another part of access to the news media that is a women-centered issue is safety. Unfortunately, the IWMF has really had to shift its work to focus almost a quarter of our work on safety issues. And this is both physical safety and digital safety. And I'm sure that the panelists will have a lot to say about what happens online to women journalists. As you just heard Lauren Wolf talk about, you really can't overstate the impact of online violence against women journalists. And I hope that we all start to use the word violence and not harassment, because it goes well beyond, it's not a bother. The consequences of online violence for women journalists are extreme. They include symptoms that are similar to PTSD, and they are driving women out of journalism, and especially young women who really, understandably, don't want to deal with the constant threats and attacks. I'll give you some examples. A woman journalist who works for the Washington Post, she works on right-wing extremists, so you can imagine the kind of hate that she receives. She's a woman of color, and she goes into parts of the U.S. where she's reporting on these groups, and she has a professional troll attacking her constantly. So before she reports on or goes on assignment, she spends 2 weeks making sure that there is no personal information online about her or her family. She stays offline for 2 weeks. She does her reporting, and then she comes back and stays offline for another 2 weeks, because it's just a fact. She's just going to get horrendously attacked for that period of time, and then she can go back and start living her normal life. But her normal life involves a professional troll who comes to rallies to look for her. And when he sees Washington Post reporters, asks them where she is. So there is no separation of online violence and physical violence anymore. They are one and the same. They very quickly become one and the same. And it's really important for everybody to understand that you need to start protecting your personal information right now, today. We can talk about resources later, but there are things that you can do and should be doing today to make sure that you and your family stay as anonymous as possible if you want to be a professional journalist, and especially if you want to be a woman journalist. It's impossible to overstate the inherent misogyny online, and that is something that women have to deal with We know that men are attacked online as well. We know that male journalists are in danger as well. But this is really a particular issue that affects women and journalists of color, as well as non-binary journalists. So anybody from an underrepresented community has to deal with this a lot more than white cis male. I think it's just, I'm not going to go much further, but just to say that the issues that we are dealing with are really serious, and they're affecting the way that coverage is happening. So it is absolutely a press freedom issue. Safety is a press freedom issue. There is a lot of self-censorship going on to ward off these attacks. Never mind talking about the rest of the world, where I was just telling Paloma that for the first time I heard on a panel somebody mention the word lawfare, which is warfare against journalists using the law, which is becoming absolutely rampant and systemic around the world, and it's keeping journalists from being able to do their work because they have to focus on staying out of jail. Obviously, the most obvious case of this is Maria Ressa, the Nobel Prize winner, who is being constantly harassed by the Philippine government. She just lost one of her law cases and has to constantly worry about being taken into custody. Rana Ayub, who couldn't be here today because she just had new charges filed against her. This happens in Mexico, it happens in Peru, it happens all over the world, and it also happens in the United States. So I think that journalists are being attacked by all sides, and women journalists just face an additional hurdle because of the gendered attacks against them. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. Next, we have Vivian Salama. She is the national security reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She has covered U.S. foreign policy and national security for nearly 2 decades, reporting from nearly 70 countries. Since moving to Washington in 2016, Salama has covered the White House and national politics for the Wall Street Journal, NBC News, and the Associated Press, with a focus on foreign policy. Before moving to Washington, Salama was the Baghdad bureau chief for the Associated Press, covering the rise and fall of the Islamic State group in Iraq and Syria, as well as Iran's growing influence across the region.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'm there in spirit with you all, and I'm definitely happy to be part of this very important topic that we're talking about today. And one of the questions I get asked most when I speak to students or at any on panels in general is what is it like being a woman in the field, and especially in some parts of the world where there is a perception that women's rights are somehow limited, or there is oppression against women, particularly in the Islamic world, where there's a lot of controversy and questions, especially from the West, about how women are treated in society. And I tell them there are pros and cons, like anything else, and my colleagues have outlined some of the challenges, but there are definitely pros, and I'm going to start kind of on an optimistic note and talk about the benefits and sort of strength of being a female journalist. Obviously, we approach topics in a very different way, and we view society sometimes in a different way than our male counterparts, and that's just part of being female and the different experiences that we have as females. And we will always evaluate certain topics in a way that is from our own perspective. Even just domestically here, we could talk about the ongoing debate about whether to ban abortion at the state level, or not, and the And they were wonderful colleagues to be with, and we would go, we would speak to the men, and we would get these amazing stories, and we would hear from them, and they would talk to us about what's happening, in their society, or, how the military might be attacking them, ISIS might be attacking them, everything they've lost. And then I go to the women, and my male colleagues generally cannot go and sit with the women to talk to them because culturally there are restrictions about the men kind of surrounding themselves. And so I would have access, and I would go in with them, and I'd take the camera, and I'd be alone with them. And let me tell you something, the women often were the chattier ones. They would tell you how it's impacting their family, what foods are limited to them, and really illustrate in a way sometimes that the men couldn't, what was happening to their lives. And that to me was a benefit, having a woman in the entourage who was able to then go and talk to them versus the men who had limitations for accessing those women. That to me was so important and highlighted the importance of having more female journalists out there where almost, to a large extent, we have broader access in certain circumstances than our male counterparts. And so that is something to consider as well, that there are pros. We hear about a lot of the cons, and we really need to highlight some of the pros besides just the fact that we bring a different perspective. Obviously, though, there are challenges. I covered the Arab Spring, and women were targeted in the crowds. And I was one of the luckier ones, but one of my best friends was assaulted. And it happens a lot. And it's not just in the Middle East, it's all over the world, including the United States. Physically, we tend to be also generally a little bit smaller than our male colleagues, and so we are susceptible to a rush of people or intense crowds, things like that, where you have to then operate in a smart way because of the fact that you may not be able to physically fend off these crowds sometimes. And I have been in countless situations where you're dealing with a crush of people, and I'm not that big. I've got to maneuver myself out of those crowds, and sometimes it's about being smart, playing it safe. Sometimes that works, and sometimes that doesn't. And sometimes as a female, you tend to be a little bit more vulnerable to those dangers. And so, I would just say that, in conclusion, it's really important to realize that we are an asset to this profession. Having reported here in the U.S., including at the previous administration, I covered the White House, and we women were a force in that White House as far as the reporting, driving the conversations, holding the administration accountable, just as much as it was the case when I was reporting overseas. I've taken several trips this year to Ukraine. Women continue to be a force to show the Russian aggression in Ukraine. I was on the front lines. Sometimes I was the only female on those front lines. But you know what? We, again, bring a different perspective and hear about their families and talk to them about their lives. And some of these soldiers felt like they could open up to women more than men because they felt like they trusted a woman more than they trusted a man. And so there are some very subtle nuances and subtle differences that we can leverage and help us to be better reporters, to be as good as our male counterparts, if not better. The field needs women, and we really do bring a unique approach to the profession. So get out there and do what you're going to do, guys, because we need you.
Thank you so much, Vivian. And finally, we have Nicole Sobecki. Nicole is a photographer and filmmaker based in Nairobi, Kenya. She is represented internationally by the photo agency 7, and Nicole is a Tufts 2008 alumna and was part of the IGL through PNDP, Exposure, and EPIC. She began her career in Turkey, Lebanon, and Syria, focusing on regional issues related to identity, conflict, and human rights. The primary focus of Nicole's work is on humanity's fraught, intimate, and ultimately unbreakable connection in the natural world. In 2008, she was awarded the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Prize in News Media for her images documenting Europe's response to the African migration crisis. Welcome back to campus.
Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say how glad I am to be here at my alma mater at this remarkable event led by the students of the Institute for Global Leadership. I can say without hesitation that discovering the IGL as a freshman here at Tufts, absolutely changed the trajectory, not only of my career, but of my life. And so it really feels like coming home. Two basic truths underpin much of what we're going to be talking about today. One is that a well-informed public is better equipped to root out corruption and, over the long haul, promote liberty and justice than an ignorant one. And two, reporting the news is an enterprise fraught with conflict, sometimes deadly, and that risk is not doled out equally. Identity is a part of what makes you more or less likely to become a target of a repressive power. So I'll focus my comments here on what I know best, which is being a photographer and being a woman. Photography brings together three precarious, uncertain elements: images, the world, and the self. We carry our identities with us wherever we go. It's part of what shapes our perspective, our voice, what we can add value, where we can add value. It's our blind spots and our limitations, and it's how others perceive and judge us. So I'd like to briefly touch on those elements, and within them more specifically, gender, geography, and creative license, and how they can impact the degree of freedom one has to tell stories and to tell stories safely. So, gender. Well, often not easy. I love being a woman, and I love working as a female photographer. To me, it's foundational. It's a vital part of how I engage with the world, how I see the world, and it has advantages, as we just heard. I find that men quite often underestimate me, and that can be an unintended gift. I often am perceived as less of a threat, and that can make access easier than, I find it often is for some of my male colleagues. I can fly under the radar more easily in many situations. And as we just heard, I completely agree with everything that has been said before me. Working in countries like Somalia, Afghanistan, Sudan, and Yemen, where I feel like I've been able to enter very specific worlds open only to women. In some of these communities, life is often divided along gendered lines in certain ways. And men are not always welcome into spaces, whereas I, as a foreign woman, can often move between both sides of the gender divide. On other stories, like a long-term project that I'm continuing to work on, exploring access to abortion in crisis and conflict zones, I've learned that some stories are just so personal and so vulnerable that it's simply easier and more natural for women to share their stories with other women. But of course, there are also many, many challenges to working as a woman in this field that are glaring and complex, and that foster a deeply unequal media environment. Only about 15% of photojournalists are women, which means that we're consuming almost all of our news from singular male perspectives. And I'm not saying those perspectives don't have value, but they're certainly not the only one that we want to be hearing from. White editors are often disproportionately higher men, particularly on stories that are physically taxing or in a conflict zone. That's not because they're better at doing them. And I don't know a single woman photographer who hasn't felt worried or insecure about how her personal choices will reflect in her professional career. And I just don't see that playing out in the same way for my male colleagues. Now, geography. In the course of my reporting, I have faced some very real challenges. In Western newsrooms, I've been overlooked and demeaned. In the field, I've been harassed, groped, attacked, and arrested multiple times. I've also been lucky in narrowly skirted situations that could have been far, far worse. But this has to be said. I can spend time living and working in some of these tough environments, and then I can leave. Because I hold an American passport, there's a certain level of protection that the vast majority of my colleagues do not have. Through my photo agency, 7, I co-lead a global fellowship program and mentor a number of mid-career photographers working in Myanmar, Iran, Hong Kong, Russia, and beyond. Most of their work is far, far more dangerous than mine. I worry about them and so many others every day, and so I'm so glad that we can come here today to raise awareness about this topic and amplify messages that were they to share directly could have very, very ugly consequences. The last thing I wanted to talk about just briefly here is creative freedom. And I realize that in the face of some of these incredibly disturbing and very tangible threats to life and liberty, that this can feel somehow less central to the conversation. But I want to at least mention it because I think it's one of the most subtle and insidious ways in which voices are silenced. It's particularly prevalent in marginalized communities of all kinds: gender, race, class, geography. If you don't believe your voice has power, or if uniformity has been foisted on you over and over again, or if the weight of one group's narrative is heralded above another, then these other violent, brutish, kind of obvious methods aren't even needed. That story and that storyteller has already been nipped at the bud. I'm talking about the freedom to create openly and disrupt the conversation, to move past the gatekeepers who, perhaps paternalistically, believe that their goals are progressive, to take risks and to stand up for what you believe in. So I'll stop here with what I find to be a very powerful idea from a writer and civil rights activist, Toni Kade-Bambara, where she says, "Freedom is the process by which you develop a practice for being unavailable to servitude." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Finally, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, Samantha Carlin. Samantha hosts the podcast YouTube show Samanthropolitics, which takes a feminist lens on international affairs. She has covered conflicts, elections, and women's movements happening in over 40 countries, and particularly elevates the voices of women as experts and commentators, interviewing luminaries and many women activists from on the ground. Samantha is also an international speaker and trainer on women's leadership through her firm Empower Global. She is a proud double Jumbo and EPIC alum, and I'll turn it over to you to start the moderated portion of our panel.
Hi, everyone. So, I think there's a couple themes that come out so far if we think about them. Access, that often can be very dangerous to be a woman journalist, but also that it can enable you to have access and people might talk to you more often. Obviously, online and offline threat, intimidation, and also that gender does influence the stories that you tell and the stories that, and how you tell them. So I think what I'd like to go to first is, I think we've heard a lot about gender shaping the stories that you tell, but how do you feel like, and don't feel like every panelist needs to answer this, but how do you feel like it shapes how you tell that story? Like, what is different about how you tell it? And maybe we can go to Nikki, Vivian, and Molly.
Well, I think one of the things that I think about a lot is how we carry our identity into the field with us. And so some of that is the stories that I choose to tell. You know, I work a lot on issues around abortion and violence against women because those are things that mean a lot to me as a woman. I certainly don't think that women are the only ones that could be reporting on them, though. It impacts how people perceive you. So I go into a situation and people are going to judge me in certain ways. They're either going to feel more they can tell me their story, or less like they can tell me their story. They're going to tell their story differently to me than they would to someone else. And gender is one factor in how those choices get made. And I think in terms of the how, that's sort of more subtle. I mean, I think that as much as I think we need to recognize and emphasize identity in these sort of more, census form ways, what is your race, what is your age, what is your class, where are you from? I think there's also identity in the terms of like, how do you experience joy? What moves you to tears? What enrages you? What's your favorite romantic movie? All of these things are parts of how we tell stories. They're parts of how you choose to emphasize or de-emphasize elements. They're parts of how you connect with another human being. And so I think it's our whole persondom that goes with us. And so there's just a sort of endless array of really vital connections that happen based on who you are.
Maybe we can move on to Vivian.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think that I tell a story differently than how my male colleagues would, and I say that in the sense of like, you know, which sounds contradictory to what I was saying earlier, but I mean, I think the key elements of a story might be there, you know, the who, what, where, when, why, the basics. I think we will tell a story in a similar way. The difference might be, you know, what we call color in a story. Sometimes we choose to emphasize different graphic elements of something, especially when you're writing for print. You have to illustrate. You have to use words to tell, you know, what's happening, what you see, what something smells like, what color things are, and you know, I know male reporters who are amazing at illustrating color. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I almost feel like it would be an interesting anthropological study to do to see if women notice different elements of a story than, you know, when they're picking up on details in front of them than the men do. But that might be one difference. You know, and then again, a lot of it for me boils down to access, who you can talk to, who you can't talk to, how much people will talk to you based on who you are. I mean, you know, I can tell you from personal experiences that there have been a lot of men, especially when you're dealing with military, for example, in foreign countries or elsewhere, where, you know, they see a foreign woman coming up to them, and there's an immediate sense of like, you know, why is she here? Where are the men? You know, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had that happen to me, where I'd be talking to them and they would almost look at me like, little girl, come on, you know. But it's about how you carry yourself and be just confident and determined to get them talking. And eventually, some of them turn out to be some of the chattiest people out there. And I think, in a way, like I said earlier, they'll almost trust you a little bit more because for them, a foreign male is a little bit of an unknown entity, but a woman is a woman somehow in their eyes. And I say leverage that, you know. I mean, I get a lot of younger students that I've taught, you know, over the years, and they'll tell me, you know, oh, but I don't want to be viewed as differently than my male counterparts. And I say that's a really good approach, but sometimes it's going to happen, and leverage it, use it to your advantage, and get these people talking if it works, you know. And so, in a way, I think that that's a different way to approach it. You're going to have challenges, and whether or not someone is more comfortable talking to one person than another based on their gender, that happens often. It happens often, but that doesn't necessarily mean the story will be any different. It just means you might get to different details of the story. So I think that's the first. That would be my takeaway.
Thank you, Vivian. Molly, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really agree with that. I think there are a lot of ways that people's underestimating you as a woman can end up being strength in terms of learning things you may not have learned otherwise, or accessing stories you may not have been able to access, or even just getting people to warm up to you in a different way, and just kind of open up more because maybe of their assumptions that you're non-threatening as a woman. So a lot of those things can help. And I think that for me personally, as I explore stories specifically about women, I choose stories where I can show women's strength. So I have a series of documentaries that I'm directing about female park rangers and and the wildlife that they protect. But I'm really trying to, I chose to make that series because I really wanted to show women in the field as leaders and as kind of people who are doing these tough jobs that a lot of people assume are men's jobs, and show them doing it just as capably and kind of as role models, hopefully, for young women who might want to get into those professions, especially in areas where it's not, it's kind of assumed that it's going to be a men's profession, and it's hard for women to get into field-based professions in the first place. So to kind of represent that and choose to find stories that represent that and highlight that strength that women have is something that I really value and try to pursue.
Thank you so much, Molly. The next question for any of you, but it was mentioned by Vivian in your opening remarks. How do you navigate reporting in areas where cultural and societal norms around gender conflict with your role as a journalist? How do you walk the line specifically between respecting the culture that you're in and pushing boundaries?
I mean, I think I've spoken to this plenty, but I'll just say, obviously, you always want to respect the culture of the place that you're in. And that I say that as someone who has face veiled, has veiled, has worn traditional clothing, and it's partly out of respect for the culture. It's partly out of protection for yourself. It's partly out of protection for the people you're meeting with. There were neighborhoods in Baghdad. Baghdad, like, you don't have to cover up. I mean, you should be modestly dressed, but you don't have to cover your hair or anything like that. But I would, from time to time, when I was going into certain neighborhoods, because I was going into the homes of certain people who, because of the fact that an unveiled woman was going into their house, it would trigger suspicion with neighbors, that kind of thing. So there are some women who are uncomfortable with that, and I would just say, if you're uncomfortable with that kind of thing, maybe that part of the world is not the right place for you. Maybe try to find a different part of the world, because it's part of the deal. I mean, you want to fly under the radar. Someone said it earlier, like, you don't want to draw attention to yourself, and so the obvious solution to that is to try to blend in as much as you can. It's partly out of being respectful, and it's partly out of taking care of yourself as you travel in these places. So it's part of the deal, but I think it is something that is important to consider, and it can be fun. You sort of learn about the culture through dressing like them and adapting, embracing some of their cultures as well, and that's an important part of reporting on their cultures.
Great. Anyone have anything else to add? Nikki, do you want to add anything on that?
Well, I very much agree with what Vivian just said. I mean, I think I work a lot in communities where I will dress differently than I would here in Boston, or wear a veil, or wear a hijab, or and to me, it's just the same way I would treat entering anyone's home. I'm in someone else's home. I'm going to be grateful to be here. I am grateful to be here, and I'm going to treat them and their culture and their customs with respect. And then I think just going back to this idea of sort of how, fortunate we are as women to be able to sort of often play, cross that gender divide. I mean, I think particularly when you are an outsider coming into a community, I've often noticed that I'm almost treated as, say, a third gender, where I'm sort of, for example, a good example of this was I was working in Yemen, and the local journalist that I had been working with was getting married. And, so there was the women's side of his wedding and the men's side of the wedding, and I was the only person that could attend both sides of the wedding. And it was kind of a recognition of, it's great for you to be with the women. We also feel comfortable with you being with us, as long as you sort of do that respectfully. And so I'm always aware of sort of the privilege I have in being able to kind of see both sides of things.
Great, thank you so much.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, please go ahead,
interesting?
Elisa.
I don't know if many of you heard recently the situation with Christiane Amanpour, who was about to interview one of the ayatollahs around the UN General Assembly in New York, and she refused to cover her hair, which she does when she goes to other countries, you know, all the time. But she spoke about it, and she said, I'm in New York. Like, I don't have to cover up in New York, and I'm not going to cover up in New York. And the interview did not happen, but I thought it was a really powerful stance that she took.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I just did a show on Iran and with a BBC journalist, and she talked about, she said, you know, something else that occurred to me in that situation is that she could have worn the hijab and taken it off mid-story, but then that would be, like, going back to the last panel, that takes attention away from, like, the story itself and turns her into an activist.
Yeah.
But then, you know, that thought never even really occurred to me. And yeah, it is, especially with, when you're thinking about women's rights and you are a woman reporter, you know, like Christiane Amanpour is like, no, this is my country now. Like, you adjust to my customs, and especially in light of the massive, you know, crackdown that's happening against women right now in Iran, that's really important to assert that boundary versus wearing the hijab in order to, like, quote unquote, get that story.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's move to you. So one thing that we've talked about a lot is that there is not gender equity in the media. I mean, 15% of photojournalists, like, that's staggeringly low. And then 36% of bylines, and then I know there's other studies about the amount of women who appear as in op-eds or on the front page of papers. Why is it so bad? And what will it take to bring about gender equity in journalism?
Yeah. So, very well documented. There is no doubt women are underrepresented in the news media globally. Many studies talk about this, and we know the consequences of this. We've talked about the consequence, the portrayal of women is impacted, the stories that are told are impacted, the way that stories are told is impacted. Why? Because the people who make up leadership in the news media around the world continue to be men. That is basically why. The decision makers, the most editors, decision makers, board members, publishers, if you think news representation is bad at the reporter level, take a look up the ladder, and it's even worse. And until that changes, the rest is not going to change. One bright light that I see is the rejection of that corporate structure by underrepresented communities, including women who are starting their own media organizations. There are numerous examples of URL Media, Global Press, numerous individuals, and ethnic media is one of the only news media that is actually thriving in the United States. So I think that there is room for the rejection of that corporate structure, which frankly I just think is going to be extremely difficult to break that. And just going off and the ability through the technology that we have today to be able to get the stories out without having that kind of backing behind you is huge, as we know, through, you know, Twitter and all the various horrible social media platforms that are out there as well. But it is important, you know, those social media platforms do somewhat level the playing field in terms of ability to get the stories out, but the playing field has much more work that needs to be done. So, you know, if you ask why, it's because it's still, the power is still in the hands of, you know, the people who hold the cultural and the money in our country and around the world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think hire women, pay them equally. Make sure that you're providing a safe and equitable environment for them to work. I think that's something that most media organizations have a lot of, there's still a pretty big gap there, and far too few resources in terms of actually supporting women who are harassed and do face discrimination. And then I also just want to say, you know, one of the things that I think I face and probably a lot of women face that's a little bit more subtle is just I think that sometimes there's a lack of trust in that women can make their own choices. So when we look at sort of places like conflict zones, war zones, physically arduous assignments, I feel like sometimes editors will sort of lean into hiring men without asking, they sort of saying like, I'd love to hire you for this, do you want to go? And then trust the woman to make the right choice for themselves. Trust if a woman is pregnant or has a family that she will make the best choices for herself, and it's not your job as an editor to make them for her. And just the last thing I would say is that, we're talking about gender here, and that's such an important part of this conversation, but it's also just about diversity, as we've said, across the board. And we all lose out when media houses are deeply undiverse. We do not, when we're not hearing from those stories, our understanding of the world is vastly limited, our understanding of ourselves and our ability to act. And so we are really the ones who, pay the price.
So much, Nikki. Does anyone on Zoom want to add to that, or we can move on to the next question? Okay, I'll take that as moving on to the next question. Nikki, actually, back to you. Much of your work has recently centered around the climate crisis. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it's like reporting on climate and conflict, and how gender shapes or influences the stories you tell related to the climate crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a great question. It's something that I feel like there's been a sort of journey that I've been on, even in understanding that, a lot of my work started out covering news and conflict, and then I worked on a long-term project for about 5 years, although these projects never really end, on the relationship between climate change and security in Somalia, which is one of the places on our planet that is hardest hit by the climate crisis. And I didn't really think that that was a story having to do with gender when I started telling it. And then it was through the course of that reporting that I realized that women are disproportionately affected by this. They are the ones responsible for their families. They are the ones, who are, everyone's losing their home, but they're the ones responsible for all of their kids and their kids' education and feeding everyone and building a home in the process of losing everything and being in extremely vulnerable situations. It vastly increases rates of violence against women, both on a domestic level and in terms of being vulnerable during the process of moving and losing one's home. And these are statistics that we know are only going up as refugee numbers increase and women, families, and men are increasingly pushed from their homes due to the climate crisis. And so it's something that I then went back and I worked with an incredible team of 7 other female photographers to tell a global story for National Geographic on women on the move and how the migration crisis was a very gendered conversation and that we needed to recognize that aspect of it.
Thank you so much, Nikki. And I think it's interesting just thinking that, you don't necessarily see gender until you walk in and then see, oh my gosh, this is all over the place. So I want to move to Vivian. And, and I don't know if you'll love this question, but when we think about our national security priorities, and you've been through multiple administrations now, do you think about the influence of your work on national security priorities and on what constitute national security and how? Oh, you are muted, Vivian.
I muted myself while I was having a sneeze attack, sorry.
That's okay.
So I mean, of course, we strive to have an impact based on our reporting, and sometimes it's pretty clear that something we're going to report is going to have an impact, and sometimes it's not clear, but it does, and sometimes it's a good impact, and sometimes it's not. Our primary objective is obviously to highlight and underscore strengths and weaknesses in our policies, and sometimes we make enemies in Washington and beyond when we start really highlighting the challenges or errors Afghanistan withdrawal being a primary example here in Washington, where national security reporters, and especially those of us who cover the White House and State Department, were not, very popular within the administration in those days because we were really hammering them for what was taking place at the time, and especially those of us who have reported both there and here had a very unique view on the situation, and particularly the plight of a lot of the Afghan staffers who would work with the foreign governments there or militaries and things like that. So, it's important, but I mean, our job is accountability, and we take that very, very seriously. We try to have an impact. I think it strays a little bit from the gender conversation, because I think my male colleagues and I are, kind of in the same boat as far as the way we approach these situations, covering especially government. It's a little bit less gender specific, although then you have the challenges of obviously workplace, empowering women in the workplace and things like that. Those tend to be more the leading conversations that we have on this side of the pond. But it's still a challenge, and national security in general still tends to be a very male-dominated profession, despite the fact that it's changing. Just like journalism was a male-dominated profession, but it's also changing, and so to be a female journalist reporting on national security issues is a little bit, it can be interesting and a challenge. That whole issue of just being taken seriously and things like that. I'm fortunate enough that I had a lot of experience abroad by the time I moved to DC, and so it was not too hard to be taken seriously by a lot of the male national security officials in town, some of whom I had more experience abroad than they did, so it helped. But I think national security in general, I could sit here and talk to you about why national security is important as a leading topic in our discourse for hours, because I'm just a little bit of a nerd when it comes to that stuff. But I'll just give you a fun example to kind of close out. Is I was the lead reporter on the Wall Street Journal story that broke the news that Donald Trump wanted to buy Greenland. And we'd been working on that story for weeks and weeks, and we thought it was just going to be this kind of weird fluke of a story where it was like, something Donald Trump says, and that's unconventional, and it turned into this international incident that went on for weeks, where he canceled his trip to Denmark and called the Prime Minister of Denmark a nasty woman because she wouldn't sell him Greenland, and it became this huge story, but apart from just like the strange and comical elements of it, it highlighted the importance of competition in the Arctic, and those conversations started coming out because of that story. And so, sometimes we don't mean to necessarily have an impact, but we do, but that should be what we strive to do every single day. And so, sometimes sometimes we mean it and sometimes we don't.
Thank you so much, Vivian. And pivoting a little bit from there for our final moderated question, and then we'll hop into audience Q&A. But Molly, can you tell us a little bit, as a National Geographic explorer, in what ways do you approach telling human versus wildlife-centered stories differently?
Well, I would say they're very different in terms of, with human stories, I think a lot about kind of thinking about the kind of psychological things going on behind the scenes, and approaching a story kind of in a sensitive way, in a thoughtful way, in terms of how I ask questions if I'm writing or filming, or how I kind of approach photographing. I think a lot about what people will feel comfortable with, and that's kind of a big part of how I start. But it's funny, I feel and
Thank you so much, Molly. So we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. Just a couple themes so far that I've heard. I loved what Molly said earlier about, do we portray women as victims, as weak or as victims, and really keeping that lens of, are we portraying women as active agents for change, or as victims? And I would also say that having a woman telling the story or interviewing women is obviously critically important to that, and making sure you're interviewing both genders and also people from the ground. I love also this concept of the third gender. It's really interesting, Nikki. I hadn't really heard that, of like being able to kind of weave comfortably between both sexes. The fact that the news media, that the publishers, editors, decision makers, and I was thinking about most of the owners of major news media, they're almost all men, right? But that at the same time, you have this opportunity and proliferation of things like ethnic media, Global Press Institute, and the fact that I started my own podcast and YouTube show with a producer, that you can go start your own podcast tomorrow and give your voice out to people on your perspective on what's going on in national security. And even if 3 people listen to it, you have no idea what impact it's going to have on them. So I think that's really important too, that we have this ability to utilize our own media and upload our thing to Anchor or YouTube that just didn't exist in the past, and to put your perspective out there, while still, I think, needing to be responsible and fact check and still embody journalistic principles. I heard from Nikki, that there can still be this kind of sexist perception of not giving women autonomy to be able to make their own decisions about their safety. And I think that that's really critical too. If we think about, especially individualistic cultures, everyone wants to make their own decisions. And there can be, and I've seen this in diversity training too, of men that decide that a woman can't take a job because it's dangerous, and they ask me for advice on how not to be perceived as sexist because women can't do that job. And I'm like, wait a second. No, women can do that job. You have to give them the choice. Maybe they want to. And we have to get through that. I loved what Vivian said about you don't know where a story will lead, and how the Greenland, thing ended up turning into all sorts of other things that you might not have initially thought. And then this concept of slow storytelling. And if we think about the IGL and what we really learn at the IGL is that you can study and study and study and study. And when I was at the IGL, we studied Bosnia for 3 months in EPIC. And then I went to Bosnia and I worked in Bosnia. And it's just, I really wanted to understand. And actually some of the things I feel like I took from EPIC, I didn't actually feel like were true on the ground, in the sense that it was perceived as an ethnic conflict with this age-old ethnic hatred. And I actually realized in Bosnia, I think that that's actually a way that we paint things to be age-old ethnic hatreds in order to not get involved from a foreign policy perspective. So once you're on the ground, it's just so interesting putting into frame what you've learned, and this concept of slow storytelling, of that you really have to be in a place and really take the time to get to know the people, to get to know the animals before jumping to conclusions about that story. So those are some of the themes that I've taken so far. But let me stop talking and open it up to you all. Please restrict your questions to 1 minute, and if you can, direct them to one panelist. If you are a student, or if you're not a student, please let us know where it is that you're coming from. So we're going to pass the mic around. So we have a question over here to our right.
Thank you for this great panel. My name is Michael Zorn. I'm at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. My question was for Elise Munoz. You mentioned lawfare, using lawyers to crack down on journalistic freedom and freedom of the press. Obviously, I work in an organization which provides pro bono legal services for journalists, unfortunately in the United States only. But how can journalists defend themselves against legal harassment, and particularly the use of legal tools to shut them and their outlets down?
Well, I think that there is definitely a need for more support from law firms to help journalists, and there are now global funds for that kind of legal support. And there's one in particular that is just starting, and I don't remember the name, but I can find out and let you know. That is global. So really, it's on the backs of nonprofit organizations and a Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, who works with numerous law firms in the United States. There are international groups, and I think it's like so many of the issues that we're talking about today. I think think a lot of journalists around the world don't understand how many resources there are available to them. I mean, obviously, at the IWMF, we would love to have many, many more resources to be able to support women journalists around the world, and we support male journalists around the world as well. So in one sense, there's never enough, and in another sense, there's more than you think there is. And so I think being aware that there are those resources and that journalists can find them. You know, a famous person who supports journalists around the world, Amal Clooney's law firm, has supported, you know, not only really well-known journalists like Maria Ressa, but also Khadija Ismailova from Azerbaijan has been represented by her law firm. So, you know, unfortunately, it does kind of seem like the harassment has to be so extreme that it's a global issue. But, I mean, there are cases in Peru of women journalists who have been harassed for decades, and they're not getting the same kind of attention. So I think Reporters Without Borders, Community to Protect Journalists, like just getting those stories out there so that the nonprofit organizations can direct their assistance to those people is really important too.
Thank you. Is there someone else who has a question?
Thank you all for a great panel. I have a question. So all of you have, to some extent, talked about not compromising, just like adhering to the regional gender norms in order to like get stories. And you also have talked about how someone would reject such norms at the expense of a story, like the incident in New York. So I guess my question is, to what extent should one compromise values and boundaries to get a story?
I think we probably all have something to say on this. I can kick it off. I mean, I guess one of the great things about this conversation that I really appreciated is that all of these questions just keep getting more complicated. And so there's no sort of hard and fast line I would put to that, except to say that you don't ever compromise your values, right? Like I think that is a boundary that I try never to cross. But I don't see it as a compromise of my values to be respectful of someone else's customs and traditions and religion. And, you know, I think that is something that I try to bring into every interaction that I have as a photographer, as a journalist, where, you know, I'm asking so much, we ask so much of the people that we work with to share their stories, to be vulnerable, to give us their time, to give us access to their lives, their families. It seems like the least we can do to kind of show up and be thoughtful and respectful and learn from them. So yeah, I guess I would just put that as like the values is the boundary you don't ever cross, but there's so many ways to kind of, you know, lean into respect and empathy within that.
I just think it's values are relative to the individual, and so yeah, you don't want to compromise your values, but also what may be a compromise in ethics or values for one person is not necessarily for another. So I agree, there's no real hard line to it. I personally would try to avoid compromising my values ever, but certain situations, you know, I don't know, I can't put a definitive like never on pretty much anything, because every situation is really unique, and sometimes, you know, if it's a safety issue, for example, you know, you might do something that you don't want to do just in the name of like staying safe and keeping your team safe, for example. So you know, there are probably circumstances that it wouldn't be a definitive yes or no, but for the most part, you know, stay true to who you are, and try to be respectful of other people's cultures, because it's not just a good way to operate in general, but it's a safety element as well.
Take another question? We're going to contribute, Molly?
Oh, I just wanted to echo that. I think that with the values, I would say I would never compromise my own set of values, but in terms of trying to get a story, I think kind of your values have to guide you in that. Like
have questions out here? Yeah. Yep, over to right to your left, Sage.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah. I'm a senior here at Tufts. Elisa, at the beginning, you talked about violence against women, both online and in person, how it translates to both spheres. I'm wondering if you could share some of the resources that you were kind of insinuating are out there for people to protect themselves, and generally to the panel about how you all protect yourselves against violence as you're reporting.
Great question. I'm very happy that you asked it. The IWMF leads a coalition against online violence that's made up of about 70 nonprofit organizations that work in this sphere. And we have created a hub that collects all of the resources of these organizations. It's the online violence, I'm blanking on the name, it'll come to me by the end of this. But anyway, you can get it from the Coalition Against Online Violence site. It'll take you directly to this hub that collects these. And there you can find risk assessments that you should be doing, risk assessments about your physical safety as well as your online safety before, during, and after a story. You can find digital security experts if you are in the process of being attacked, who can kind of walk you through what you should be doing. Or if you're about to do a really risky story, let's say you're doing a story about Russian trolls, for example, you definitely want to either go through the risk assessment yourself, but I would suggest you take it a step further and actually try to get in touch with a digital security expert who can help you go through, it's called digital hygiene, who can help you go through all of your accounts and make sure. There are some services that have very low subscription rates that we encourage all media organizations to get those subscriptions for their journalists. One is called Privacy Duck. You've probably seen ads for it online, but it does. All of our staff at the IWMAF have subscriptions. It clears, you can add family members as well, and it looks for your private information online and takes it down. And this is something you have to do constantly. You can't just do it once. So unfortunately, somebody's going to have to shell out for this subscription. We have emergency support that would actually cover some of these subscriptions if you felt that you were particularly going to be attacked. We have emergency support for trauma support is increasingly an issue that male and female journalists face around the world. It's one of the highest requests that we get at the IWMAF is help getting trauma support from a specialist. So in terms of security too, we also have a physical security director at the IWMAF who will talk to you for an hour if you're about to go to Mexico and talk through the kinds of things that you should be thinking about. During the whole Afghanistan exodus, he spent 24/7 just walking people through the gauntlet of the airport in Afghanistan, and it was a really horrible thing, but thank God we had him. So there are all of these, or we can point you to an organization that can get you a different kind of support. It's just a matter of really doing the research and looking for that help, and just, you cannot go out into a story blindly. If you're a freelancer, it's one thing, and then you can come to us, you can come to nonprofit organizations. But if you are on staff, you really need to demand that your media organization accept that duty of care to provide these things for you.
Awesome. What an amazing resource.
That, IWMF helped me with the hostile environment training, and I happened to be in Mexico working on a story about wildlife trafficking in an area with cartel activity, and it was unbelievably helpful for me and taught me a huge amount of things that I realized I should have known earlier, and just the resources that you guys have available, and just talking to people during that training and kind of learning from them about how I could approach different situations was so valuable. So I would definitely recommend anyone who is going into journalism, especially in riskier situations. That course has helped me a huge amount since I took it, and just opened my mind and made me conscious of risks I hadn't even thought about preparing myself for. So thank you for that.
I have also received grants from the IWMF, and so I think that's the fact that 50% of our panel has already been positively affected speaks to.
There's also the element of freelancing versus for the most part, most news organizations, when they're sending you overseas, if you're going into hostile environments, I mean, they're going to train you. It's actually required for insurance purposes. They're going to train you on hostile environment training. They're going to give you the flak jackets, the helmets, all the gear that you need for safety. Freelancers don't necessarily have that kind of support. I was a freelancer in more zones for years, and a lot of freelancers, because of the cost, may shrug off that need, like not necessarily get the gear, or if they get the gear, they won't get high quality gear, or they might skip out on hostile environment training. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to go through all of that. It is so, first of all, the hostile environment training is fun, but also you get to learn a lot of really good first aid techniques and things like that. They teach you about, how to act in a hostage situation and all this other stuff too. And you're supposed to repeat it. I repeat it every couple of years. There's no getting enough of it. But as freelancers in particular, there's so much emphasis because you're not as watched. You don't have, I travel now with a security team. I didn't have that luxury when I was freelancing and going into really dangerous places over the years. And so I would just say, as a freelancer, you guys should definitely consider turning to organizations that do support journalists, because they are primarily there for everybody, but especially for freelancers who don't necessarily have that support system within a news organization.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I encourage you to look up, we did some kind of fun safety snacks that we just started on TikTok, and there's a lot of horrible things about TikTok, but my staff are putting on these really great little short videos, and one of them is how to get out of zip ties using your shoelaces, and also how to get out of duct tape. So like those are just like the tricks of the trade that, God help us that you never have to use them, but they work, and so there are tricks that you can use. And I just want to really quickly add that a lot of major media organizations are able to provide things like hostile environments training, but they also get overwhelmed by events. And we know numerous, media organizations that have sent many journalists to Ukraine because they've gone through their roster. So they've gone through everybody that had the hostile environments training through Ukraine, and they all came home, and they don't want to go back right away. Maybe they've been there for 3 weeks. So now they're going to their reporters who don't do the conflict beat, who haven't had the hostile environments training, but they're sending them anyway. And so there are a lot of people in Ukraine currently who have never had hostile environments training. There are, I'll just say it, the Washington Post took several weeks before they had a security director on the ground with their journalists, who I applaud them, mostly women journalists from the Washington Post covering Ukraine and doing remarkable work. But, they fall prey to the same 24-hour news cycle, too many crises around the world, can't keep up with what we should be doing. And it really is up to the journalists to demand those resources of their employers as well.
And I will just say one more thing, is that I'm someone who is highly trained, has had tons of on-the-ground war experience, has been trained in a hostile environment, had a security team with us, and 2 months ago I had a very close call on the front lines in Ukraine. So you can never be too complacent in terms of getting too confident. War is unpredictable, it is always dangerous, and so, no matter how much experience you have, no matter what kind of security system you have around you, a security team, or whatever it is that you've got going, you still have to just be very, very careful about operating in those environments and think twice about it always, because it's always dangerous.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question from the audience. Great.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives today. I'm Sonia. I'm lucky to call Nicole my sister-in-law. And I had a question, actually, basically a follow-up to the last question. Elisa, you talk a lot about physical and digital safety, but also about the importance of social media and its ability to amplify voices that don't have access to traditional media channels. And so those two things feel a little bit in conflict to me. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, they're totally in conflict, and actually I remembered a bunch of the media organizations that I think you all should look up. So, and you've probably heard of a lot of them, but the 19th is an all-women founded and women-run organization covering politics from diverse perspectives. Incredible. We gave them one of their first grants, and they're working on a nonprofit. They actually are a for-profit, but they get a lot of support from foundations. URL Media, I mentioned, there's Capital B that is covering politics from the perspective of journalists of color. MLK 50 is another one. So, it is giving this opportunity for smaller news organizations to be out there making a huge difference. We have, I think, given digital security training to all of those news organizations. And we give digital security training to editors at the Seattle Times, The Guardian. They're behind the times. These are major media organizations with a lot of money, and when it comes to digital security, they are just so far behind the times. And if you ask me why, I'll tell you again. It's because most of the people in power are white men who are not experiencing these things at the same level as the journalists on the field. And because of this 24-hour news cycle, the need to survive, the money issues, they just don't take the time to listen to their journalists about what's happening on the ground. Another phenomenon that I'm sure you guys are familiar with is this lack of willingness of people experiencing these attacks to speak up because of the very patronizing attitude of, well, let's take you off the story. Oh, it's too hard. Let's not deal with that. Let's just not, put you aside. That's not the answer. The answer is to stand behind your journalists, to train your journalists, to be there for them. An increasing tactic against journalists, we talked about lawfare, is also these trolls. And I say that, I can't say this enough. This is not an organic process. This is not something that is just random, crazy people are attacking a journalist. These are organized attacks that are very systematic, and they all look the same. And the main reason is to discredit the journalists. And sometimes the stated objective is to get a journalist fired. And sometimes the journalists do get fired. And that is the worst thing ever. Media organizations need to stand by their journalists. They need to make public statements for and on behalf of their journalists when they're being attacked. And they need to provide the security that they need, even if it means housing them somewhere else for a few weeks because they've been doxxed or something like that. So it's a double-edged sword. Unfortunately, it is the reality that we live in.
Well, thank you to everyone. I mean, some of the things that I heard is that risk is not doled out equally, but at the same time, that shouldn't prevent women from being able to be storytellers, and that media organizations need to stand behind journalists. I've heard how amazing your organization is and how grateful everyone is for the existence of those support systems, and also to push against boundaries, sexist boundaries of people telling you what kind of story you should tell or how you should tell it. So I think, I at least am grateful that all of you are storytellers. And it's good to see Nikki again after us being an epic 20, oh my God, I don't know, a long time ago.
I also want to thank, this is our last panel, our 5th panel of this 3-day symposium, and there are way too many people to thank, but first and foremost, Heather Berry and Michaela from the IGL who have made this possible. I cannot thank them enough for their tireless support for this symposium that us student leaders a couple weeks ago came up with this, and we were like, let's make this happen in about 4 weeks, and we did it. So major shout out to the student leaders, Meg, Paloma, Sage, Grace, Francisco, Gowrie, Arjun, and many more who have put in countless hours on top of a full schedule of classes to make this happen. The Tisch College has been wonderful too in giving us space and support, especially thank you to Dean McField and Dean Cunningham. And we also want to thank the IGL alumni who have put so much faith and support behind the current students and have shown how wonderful this network and this community is and the impact that we all can have when we come together. This week has been wonderful with panels on press under authoritarian regimes, mis and disinformation. We heard from Christina Goldbaum, who is a correspondent for Afghanistan this morning for the New York Times. We heard about occupation and war. And finally, to be surrounded by you all, it's been super inspiring, eye-opening, thought-provoking, and I just hope everyone was able to take a lot away from these conversations and bring them into your world. So we will have lunch at Curtis Hall, which is, we will all be walking that way afterwards. And so college students especially, I know you like free food. We've got you. But thank you again to everyone, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
chat with you more. I've been doing this talk show for 2 years, and I haven't really figured out how to get any resources or really do. I mean, it's basically a feminist lens on global politics. So you
program too.
Yeah, I saw the grants program, but isn't it? It says like at least the Howard Buffett grant says you have to be a full-time journalist, which I'm not. But it's also because I can't afford to be a journalist. So I mean, let me let you.
Yes, be in touch.
Samantha, you know my wife Susan Williams. She's with the Fletcher Women's